They didn't just mess with my yard, they rewired the rain itself. And for a while, I just stood there watching it happen like an idiot, thinking maybe it was a fluke, maybe just a bad storm. Yeah, turns out it wasn't. It was deliberate, calculated, engineered. And the craziest part? It all started with what looked like the most boring suburban upgrade you could imagine, a bigger driveway. So I've been living on Alder Creek Lane for about a decade now. Quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, just rows of houses that all look like they were copy-pasted with slight personality tweaks, different mailboxes, different shades of beige, that kind of thing. My place sits just a little lower than the one next door. Not dramatically, just enough that if water wanted to move downhill, it would eventually end up near my foundation, but for 10 years, it never mattered. The drainage worked fine, the grading was standard, everything flowed the way it was supposed to. No issues, no drama, no neighbor feuds. Then came Daniel Harper. Now, Daniel wasn't new to the neighborhood. He'd been there a couple years, but we had that classic suburban relationship. You know, the polite nod, the occasional, hey man, nothing deeper. But somewhere along the way, Daniel decided his house needed an upgrade. Not a renovation. No, this was about presence. Control. The kind of upgrade that says, I've made it, and I need everyone within a 50-foot radius to know it. He tore out his old driveway and replaced it with this massive concrete spread. Wider, longer, cleaner, probably added close to 1,000 square feet of hard surface. And look, I get it. People improve their homes all the time. That's not the issue. The issue is what he did next. Along the edge of that new driveway, right where his property line meets mine, he installed this subtle little channel, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't random. It was directional. It pointed straight at my yard. No conversation, no heads up, no, hey, just so you know, this might affect drainage. Nothing. Just concrete and consequences. The first storm hit about 2 weeks later, heavy rain, nothing unusual for the season. I remember standing by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the water run down his driveway. And that's when I saw it. The flow wasn't spreading out like it used to. It was gathering, accelerating, funneling, like someone had built a highway for water. And the destination? My property line. Within minutes, my yard started pooling. Not puddles, pooling. The kind of standing water that doesn't just disappear after the rain stops. It lingered. It soaked. It pushed into the soil around my foundation like it had somewhere to be. I told myself it was temporary. One storm doesn't mean anything, right? Wrong. The second storm did the same thing. The third one made it worse. And by the time we hit month 3, I wasn't dealing with a yard issue anymore. I was dealing with a structural problem. I crawled into my crawl space one Saturday morning, and the smell hit me before I even got all the way in. Damp, heavy, that unmistakable scent of mold settling in like it had signed a lease. The insulation was sagging, the wood felt soft in places, and when I checked the moisture levels, 38%. That's not a little damp. That's you're about to spend money you don't have. And I did. Weekends turned into damage control. I was ripping out insulation, dragging out soaked materials, running a dehumidifier that sounded like it was fighting for its life 24/7, and still losing. My electric bill spiked, my time disappeared, and every time it rained, I felt that same knot in my chest because I knew exactly what was about to happen. Meanwhile, Daniel, living his best life. Clean driveway, dry foundation, probably admiring how efficiently everything drained. Yeah, no kidding. It was draining straight into my problem. That's when it stopped being an accident in my head. Because here's the thing, water doesn't suddenly change behavior like that unless someone changes the system. And Daniel's system was working too well. So I started documenting. Every storm, every puddle, every inch of standing water. I took photos, time-stamped everything, built a little archive of this is not normal. I even went digging into county regulations, the kind of stuff nobody reads unless they absolutely have to. And sure enough, there it was, plain as day. You can't alter your property in a way that increases runoff onto a neighboring lot. Simple rule. Common sense, really. But Daniel either didn't know or didn't care. So I brought in a civil engineer, licensed, experienced, the kind of guy who looks at dirt and immediately knows where the water's going to go before it even rains. He walked the property, took measurements, studied the slope, the concrete, the channel, and then he looked at me and said, "Yeah, this is intentional." The new design is concentrating runoff and directing it straight toward your foundation. Intentional. That word stuck with me. Because now it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a decision. A choice someone made knowing it would affect me. I took that report, filed a formal complaint, and sent Daniel a certified letter with everything attached. Photos, data, the engineer's findings, all of it. I wasn't aggressive about it, just factual. Clear. Hey, this is happening. It's causing damage. We need to fix it. You'd think that would be enough, right? Yeah, no. A couple days later, I get an email from him. 2 lines, that's it. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the report, nothing. Just, rain is a natural occurrence. You might want to look into installing French drains. That was it. No responsibility, no discussion, just a shrug in text form, and a subtle little, your problem, not mine. And I remember just staring at that email for a minute, rereading it like maybe I missed something, some hint of accountability, some willingness to work it out. But there was nothing there. Just dismissal. That's the moment things shifted for me. Because up until then, I was trying to solve a problem. After that, I realized I was dealing with a person who had already decided the problem wasn't his. And once someone locks into that mindset, they're not going to meet you halfway. They're going to wait you out. Or worse, ignore you completely. So yeah, I did look into solutions. I did my research. I talked to contractors, checked codes, ran through options, and somewhere in that process, I came across something interesting. Something simple. Something legal. Something that didn't fight the water, it just redirected it. And for the first time in months, I remember thinking, okay, if that's how you want to play this, I can play too. All right, before I tell you what I did next, let me break something down real quick. Because this part right here, this is where most people get it wrong. All right, quick pause, because this is the part most people either misunderstand or completely ignore until it's too late. And I get it. Nobody moves into a quiet suburban neighborhood thinking they're going to need a crash course in drainage law and human behavior. But here we are. According to standard procedure, when you modify your property, especially something like adding a large impermeable surface, concrete, asphalt, anything that stops water from soaking into the ground, you are responsible for how that change affects surrounding properties. Water doesn't respect fences, it follows physics, and the law knows that. That's why most county codes, HOA rules, and municipal guidelines all say some version of the same thing. You cannot increase runoff onto your neighbor's land. Not accidentally, not indirectly, not, oops, I didn't think about it. If your upgrade creates a new problem next door, that's on you. From a legal perspective, what Daniel did falls into a category called altered drainage impact. And yeah, it sounds boring, but it's actually a big deal. Because once you can prove that someone's modification changed the natural flow of water and caused measurable damage, you're no longer arguing opinions. You're dealing with liability. That's why documentation matters so much. Photos, reports, timestamps. You're building a timeline that says, this didn't exist before, now it does, and here's why. But here's where it gets more interesting, and honestly, more human. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into, especially in neighbor disputes. It's called diffusion of responsibility. Daniel didn't see himself as the cause of the problem. He saw rain as the cause. Natural event. Out of his control, nothing to do with him. That mental shortcut lets people dismiss consequences without feeling like the bad guy. Add a little ego, a little investment in his new driveway, and suddenly admitting fault feels like losing. So instead, he minimizes, deflects, tells me to handle it on my side. And that right there, that's the moment you stop expecting cooperation and start thinking strategically. Because once someone reframes reality to protect themselves, logic alone isn't going to change their mind. Consequences will. So after that email, yeah, something in me just clicked. Not in a dramatic, movie villain way, more like a quiet recalibration. Like, all right, we're not solving this together. I'm solving this correctly. And there's a difference. I stopped trying to convince Daniel. Stopped replaying that 2-line email in my head. Stopped expecting some sudden moment of neighborly decency. Because honestly, that was never coming. What I had instead was something way more useful, clarity. I knew the facts, I had documentation, and most importantly, I understood the rules. So I leaned into that. I called the county office again, double-checked everything. Permits, property line regulations, drainage compliance. I even asked very specific questions, like, What am I allowed to build on my side that doesn't violate code but still protects my property? And the answer I got was surprisingly straightforward. As long as I didn't redirect water onto someone else's property in an unnatural way, and as long as I stayed within height and placement limits, I was allowed to install a barrier. Not a wall, not some aggressive structure, just a modest, code-compliant berm. 4 inches high, continuous, on my property line. That was it. Now, 4 inches doesn't sound like much, but when you're dealing with surface water, slope, and momentum, 4 inches is a decision. It's a line in the sand that says, this is where your problem stops becoming mine. So I hired a contractor. Not Daniel's guy, no chance. I wanted someone who understood grading, who would follow specs exactly, no shortcuts. We pulled permits, marked the line, and installed that berm clean and precise. It didn't look dramatic, honestly. If you walked by, you might not even notice it unless you knew what it was doing. But I knew, because I had seen how his system worked, and now, I had introduced a counter system. Not illegal, not aggressive, just corrective. And then we waited. The forecast showed rain 3 days later. Not a drizzle, a real storm. The kind that had been wrecking my weekends for months. And I remember that morning, standing by the same window, same coffee in my hand. But this time, different feeling. Not anxiety, not frustration, just curiosity. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering if the water would come. I was wondering where it would go. The rain started slow, then picked up, steady, heavy, the kind that turns driveways into rivers. And sure enough, Daniel's driveway kicked into action right on schedule. Water gathered, accelerated, funneled down that channel he built so confidently, headed straight for my property line. And then it hit the berm. And stopped. Well, not exactly stopped, redirected. You could actually see it hesitate for a second, like it reached a dead end, and then it did what water always does. It followed the path of least resistance. Only now, that path wasn't my yard anymore. It curved, shifted, slid right along the berm, and back toward his side, toward the natural slope, toward his foundation. I didn't say a word. I just watched. Storm kept going for hours. And for the first time in months, my yard didn't flood. No pooling, no saturation creeping toward my crawl space, no sinking feeling in my gut, just rain doing what it was supposed to do. Meanwhile, next door, different story. I didn't see it happen in real time, but I heard about it pretty quick. Around 7:30 that evening, my phone rings. It's Daniel. And let me tell you, his tone? Completely different. Gone was the dismissive, two-line email energy. This guy sounded rattled. Hey, we've got water in the basement. Like, a lot of water. I paused. Not for effect, just letting that sentence land. How much is a lot? I asked. 6 inches, he said. It's coming in fast. I think it's from the driveway. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. Yeah, something had been wrong for months. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I walked over, because despite everything, I'm not the kind of person who lets someone deal with flooding alone. His basement was exactly what you'd expect. Water across the floor, boxes soaked, that frantic energy of trying to move things that are already ruined. His contractor was there too, looking just as confused as Daniel used to sound confident. And then the contractor noticed the berm. You could see it click in his head. He stepped outside, looked at the slope, the driveway, the channel, and then back at Daniel. No words for a second, just that silent, oh. That's when the conversation changed. No more rain is natural. No more handle it yourself. Suddenly, we were talking about solutions. Real ones. Immediate ones. Within 48 hours, Daniel had his contractor back out there. This time regrading the entire driveway apron. They broke up sections of that channel, adjusted the slope, redirected runoff away from both properties instead of concentrating it like a weapon. It wasn't cheap either. You could tell by the urgency alone. And then, a couple days after that, he came over, knocked on my door, check in hand. $4,200. Covers the crawl space remediation, insulation replacement, moisture treatment, the whole mess I'd been dealing with for months. No argument, no negotiation, just a quiet acknowledgement that, yeah, this had gone too far. We didn't shake hands like in a movie. No big apology speech. Just a short conversation, a lot of eye contact, and an understanding that things had recalibrated. He hasn't touched that driveway since. Not a single modification. And me? I never installed French drains. Didn't need to. Because the issue was never about managing water on my side. It was about correcting what was being pushed onto it in the first place. And once that balance was restored, everything else fell back into place. Now look, I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. There was no victory lap, no dramatic gotcha moment. What I got was something better, control over my own property again. Peace of mind when it rains. The ability to sit by that same window, coffee in hand, and not feel like I'm watching a slow-moving disaster creep toward my foundation. And Daniel? Well, he learned something too. Probably the hard way. Because here's the thing about systems, whether it's water flow, property law, or just basic human behavior. When you push a problem downhill long enough, eventually it finds its way back. Just sometimes faster than you expect. All right, so what's the actual takeaway from all this, beyond don't mess with drainage? Because there's a bigger lesson here, and it applies way beyond driveways and rainstorms. So yeah, on the surface, this is a story about water, concrete, and a guy who thought a bigger driveway was worth more than a conversation. But if that's all you take from it, you're missing the part that actually matters. Because this wasn't really about rain, it was about boundaries. And not the kind you build with fences, the kind you enforce with actions. The lesson here is, most conflicts don't start explosive, they start subtle. A small decision, a quiet assumption, a this probably won't affect anyone kind of move. And then slowly, over time, that decision expands until it lands on someone else's life. Their time, their money, their stress. And at that point, you've got two choices. You either absorb it, or you respond to it. Now here's where people get stuck. Because responding doesn't mean reacting emotionally. It doesn't mean yelling over the fence or turning it into some neighborhood Cold War. That's the trap. That's exactly what situations like this want you to do. Burn energy, lose focus, make it personal. But if you pay attention, the real leverage was never emotional. It was structural. I didn't get back at Daniel. I didn't sabotage anything, didn't escalate beyond what was necessary. I just understood the system better than he expected me to, and then I used that system exactly the way it was designed to be used. That's a completely different kind of power, because once you step out of the emotional loop and into the framework, laws, codes, cause and effect, you're not arguing anymore. You're operating. And people who rely on dismissal or avoidance, they don't know how to deal with that. From a legal perspective, this whole situation is actually pretty simple when you strip away the frustration. Property ownership comes with responsibility, not optional responsibility, automatic. If your improvements create measurable harm next door, you don't get to shrug and call it nature. The system doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because if it did, every uphill property would become a liability for everyone below it. That's why documentation matters. That's why patience matters. That's why you don't jump straight into confrontation without understanding what you can actually enforce. Because once you do, your position changes. You're no longer asking someone to be reasonable. You're showing them what reality looks like when they aren't. And then there's the psychological side of it. This is a psychological trap that shows up in all kinds of everyday situations, not just neighbor disputes. When someone benefits from a change, even unintentionally, they're going to resist seeing the downside of it. It's uncomfortable. It threatens their sense of control, their investment, their image of themselves as a reasonable person. So instead, they minimize. They deflect. They tell you to solve it on your end. Not because they're evil. Most of the time, they're not. But because acknowledging the problem would mean accepting responsibility for it. And that's a cost people try to avoid until they can't anymore. Daniel didn't change because I explained things better. He changed because the outcome changed. Because for the first time, the system he built started affecting him. That's when clarity shows up real fast. And that's something a lot of people struggle to accept. You can't always reason someone into accountability, but you can create conditions where accountability becomes the easiest option. Not through revenge, not through escalation, but through alignment with how things are supposed to work. That's the difference between fighting a person and correcting a system. And honestly, that approach scales. Work, family, friendships, business, any environment where someone's decisions start bleeding into your space. The instinct is always to confront directly, to push back emotionally, to demand fairness. But sometimes the smarter move is quieter, more deliberate. You step back, understand the structure, and then make one move that shifts everything. That berm, That wasn't just a piece of concrete. It was a boundary made visible, a signal that said, I'm not carrying this anymore. And the moment that boundary existed, everything else had to adjust around it. The water, the driveway, Daniel's decisions, all of it. Because systems don't argue, they respond. So if you're dealing with something like this, maybe not drainage, maybe it's noise, property lines, shared spaces, whatever it is, the takeaway isn't get even. It's get clear. Understand what's actually happening, what's allowed, what isn't, and then act in a way that restores balance without creating a bigger mess. Because once you do that, you don't need to win an argument. The situation resolves itself. And I'm curious, have you ever had a neighbor, a coworker, anyone really, take a problem that was clearly theirs and somehow make it yours? And if you did, what was the moment you decided, yeah, not anymore?